Hello, new prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for April 26th, 2021. Great to be back with you guys after taking a week off. Want to say thanks for Drew for stepping in and doing such a wonderful job with these RTBs for the past week. And looking forward to diving right in with these texts that we have for today. And this is a pretty special day because we have two new books that we're going to be looking at today. We've got the book of Hebrews and the book of Song of Solomon, of all things. So we're going to be jumping right into those. And then we also have Numbers chapter 37, or Numbers 3, and then Psalm 37. So we finished up Leviticus while I was gone. I know you guys were probably pleased with that. And we started Numbers. So I'll try to give some brief introductory things on Numbers, as well as with Song of Solomon and Hebrews. But of course, we have limited time, so I'm just going to kind of try to hit on some high notes. And as we go through books like Song of Solomon and Hebrews, we'll hit on some other things as we go along as well for these next few days. So let's dive right in, and why don't we start with the book of Psalms today. So we'll look at Psalm 37. Psalm 37 is a wisdom psalm. So you'll notice that, again, Psalms are divided based on their types by scholars. Generally speaking, these types refer to not just the content of the psalm, but also the form of the psalm. And this is the psalm will have certain characteristics. So a wisdom psalm, for instance, is a psalm that deals with some of the wisdom themes that we might find, for instance, in Proverbs. And so you'll find some of the sayings that we find in the psalm are very similar to some of the things you might find in Proverbs. So themes that often present contrasts. So the life of wisdom versus foolishness, the life of righteousness versus wickedness, the life of the industrious versus the lazy, these types of things. That's one of the characteristics of wisdom literature, and this is what we find in this psalm. It's actually in a partial acrostic psalm. It's an interesting acrostic because it's the odd number of verses that are the ones that begin with the subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So again, when you use acrostics, it's communicating by using all the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, you're communicating totality, and that's probably what is being communicated here as well, the totality of a life lived in wisdom to God. Some of the recurring themes that you find in here are themes like the unjust prosperity of the wicked, for instance, the ultimate destruction of the wicked. But I want to focus our attention on one of the verses, probably the most famous verse in Psalm 37, which is verse 4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of His heart. Now, again, this is a parallel. These are parallel lines. This is something called parallelism in Hebrew, where you have two lines of poetry that correspond in some way. And I think in this case, one line kind of explains the other. Delighting yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Now, does that mean that, God's going to give us everything that we want in this life, that He's going to give us all the wealth, health, and prosperity that we desire? Well, I don't think that's what the text is saying. And I think the first part of verse 4 actually explains why. Because when you delight yourself in the Lord, your heart is going to be aligned with His. Your desires are going to be aligned with His. And so you will have your will being brought into conformity with the Lord's. And so that's the reason why this is a truth that we can maintain for today. So good text here in Psalm 37. And let's move on to the book of Numbers. So in Numbers, this is if you remember, coming out of Leviticus, we're still at Mount Sinai as we start the book of Numbers. And this starts a dreary period in the history of Israel of about 40 years where they are wandering around in the wilderness. And this whole entire book of Numbers is very selective. The author chooses what to include in these chapters for a purpose. And the author being Moses here, I think that purpose ultimately is to show some of the dangers of disobedience and the dangers of murmuring and complaining and dissatisfaction with the Lord within a covenant relationship with Him. But of course, the historical setting here is that the Israelites are about to go into the promised land, and they are, preparing, making those preparations. And as we read through these initial chapters of Numbers, everything seems to be hunky dory, to use a technical term. Everything seems to be fine. They seem to be ready to go into the promised land with no problems whatsoever. And so all these preparations are preparations that they would normally make. So, for instance, we have all the numbering of the tribes of men who are of fighting age and upwards, these censuses in the book of Numbers that prepare the Israelites for that conquest of the promised land. Now, of course, the census in the book of Numbers actually frames the book. So you have a census here in chapter 1, and then you have some other preparations as well where they're numbering people here in the first few chapters, 1 through 3, really. And then at the end of the book in Numbers 26, starting the last section of the book, you have another census. And in between those censuses, we have, of course, a lot of people dying, a lot of people rebelling against the Lord, because that leads to that death and wandering around in this forbidding wilderness for 40 years. But at this point in time in the narrative, there's no hint that that's going to happen. And so as we're reading through all these preparations, whether it's the assignment of the duties of the priests, the redeeming of the firstborn here in the book of Numbers chapter 3, all these preparations are for that purpose of entering into the promised land, and everything seems to be going fine at this point. That will all change in just a few chapters. Of course, one of the other big issues with the book of Numbers is, of course, the numbers of Numbers. We call it Numbers because, of course, the existence of these two censuses at the beginning and the end of the book. And these numbers have, frankly, to be honest, caused many Christians problems. I'm not going to go into the issues in a very detailed way because I don't have time to do that. But I will say this, that there are, I think, answers to the difficulties of these numbers. Let me just give you an example. I mean, in chapter 1 of Numbers, we have that number. I think it's 600,000 plus men of fighting age. That's a lot of men, right? That are fighting age and upward of 20 and above or so. And that would mean at the very least, over 2 million people in the camp of Israel. That's a lot of folks. And if we look at chapter 3, for instance, and you have the numbered men of firstborn men are 22,273. If you do the math there, that gives you women having like 50 plus babies in order for this to be mothers having that many kids. So there are some very, very real logistical issues with these numbers of Numbers. And there are many different answers to this. I've opened up the can of worms, haven't I? So let me just give you some answers. One is that regardless of the number of people and wandering around in the wilderness, right, this is a miraculous event of God. I mean, if you ever look at pictures of the Judean wilderness, where in the Sinai wilderness where they are and are wandering around, this is a forbidding desert region. Even if the numbers were much lower, this would be something that would be a miraculous event for God to preserve them for that long. The other thing that I think we can say is that it very much could be literal numbers here. But there are some evangelicals who argue for different things to deal with the difficulties of the large numbers here. One is, and by the way, this is an evangelical debate. These are all people who are taking the Bible seriously. One interpretation is to interpret the number 1,000 as the word 1,000 in Hebrew is a word that can be translated as clan or fighting troop or something like that. So that's another way of looking at it, which would get you a lower number. Another is to look at, for instance, this number in chapter 3, verse 43, 22,273. You could translate that then as 220 or as 22 fighting troops numbering 273 men of firstborn or something like that. There's some problems with that interpretation as well. Some people argue that the numbers are hyperbolic, and this would be a way of reading it as the way perhaps some of the ancient reader would have read it, as a hyperbolic kind of conquest narrative. But regardless, I think what we can say about all these numbers that we find here, especially as you compare the number here at the very beginning of the book and the number at the end of the book, one of the things you see is that there's not a lot of variance in those numbers. In other words, the people of Israel aren't anymore being fruitful, multiplying, filling the earth, and subduing it. They're not growing. The promises of God seem to have been withdrawn from them. And why? Now, the promises haven't been withdrawn, but God's blessing has been withdrawn from his people. His covenant blessings have been withdrawn from his people. Why? Because, as we will find out in just a few chapters, because of their disobedience, frankly, a disobedience that goes from the very from the lowest ranks of people, the common folks in the camp, all the way up to the top, to Moses himself in Numbers chapter 20. So that's the book of Numbers. Hopefully I didn't raise more questions than I answered there. So let's move on to the book of Song of Solomon, speaking of raising questions. So Song of Solomon is a wonderful book. Obviously, it's a very needed book, I think, for today. It's, as one of the interpreters, Richard Hess, called it, an adult book. Makes it very difficult when it comes to teaching and for interpretation. So many people have interpreted the book of Song of Solomon allegorically, as a kind of a picture of Jesus in the church or something like that. It is a very much a book that deals with a lot of touchy issues, you could say, the issues of sexuality and marriage. I think the better way of looking at the text is not allegorically, although obviously it is true that God pictures his relationship with his people and Jesus's relationship with the church in this marital way. But I think this is a book that is much more at home, being interpreted as what it seems to be on the surface, and that is a book about the beauty of the sexual relationship within the marriage relationship that God ordained from the very beginning of time. As Danny Aiken, president of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, has a great book on this, calls it God's Instruction Manual for Sex and Marriage. And so I think what it does, though, is it provides, and this is something I use in my classes, a properly oriented, sexually charged book for a promiscuously oriented, sexually charged culture. In other words, it is such a needed book because it provides a helpful corrective to the in-your-face perversion of sexuality that we find in our world today, by showing the beauty of sexuality as God intended it. And I think for a long time, the church has been known as a body that has, when it comes to sexuality, we've kind of avoided it. We haven't talked about it. And when we do talk about it, we talk about it in very negative terms. Sex is bad. And I think we've lost an opportunity as a church, when it comes to books like Song of Solomon, to show not just the dangers of sexuality which are very real, aren't they? Outside the marriage context, the dangers of sexuality are very real, and there is very much a perversion of that in our world today. But I think we've lost the opportunity to present the positive. The analogy I always use is the analogy of the abortion debate. So, for instance, in the abortion debate, for a long time, all we were doing is saying that abortion is bad, when we weren't really emphasizing the beauty and the gift of life. So also with the issue of sexuality, I think so often we emphasize, the dangers of sexuality outside that context that God created it for. And we don't emphasize the beauty of it within the context that God did create it for. And that is something that I think you find in the book of Song of Solomon. Now, this is going to be, it's going to be very figurative, and it's and poetic in its presentation of the love relationship between these two lovers within a marriage context. And so as you read through it, we'll talk more about it as we go along. I think you want to keep that in your mind, that what it's presenting is the beauty of sexuality. And we'll talk more about the kind of the theology of that in coming days. And then finally, that brings us to our last book that we're beginning, and that is the book of Hebrews. This is really, we're starting now with Hebrews. We're starting what are known as the general epistles in the New Testament. So these are the last books in the New Testament, starting with Hebrews and going all the way through Revelation. So we've finished with the letters of Paul with Philemon. And Hebrews is a book that has been controversial in the past just because of the authorship issue. We don't really know who the author is. It's officially anonymous. Some have suggested Luke or Apollos or Barnabas or even Priscilla, or Pauline authorship is always a popular one for some. Jerome and Augustine argued for St. Jerome and St. Augustine argued for Pauline authorship, for instance. But there's really no evidence one way or the other, I don't think. There may be some who feel very strongly about it, but I don't really feel that strongly. I think it's best viewed as anonymous, and it's also viewed, I think, best viewed as I think a good way of looking at it is an epistolary sermon. In other words, this is a sermon in the context of a letter. And it's written specifically, probably prior to AD 70, when we had the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. And it's to forestall some apostasy. And so you find some warning texts in here. And it's written, of course, to a Jewish Christian audience struggling with maintaining their faith. And so that explains a lot of the imagery that we find in this book. And one of the things I love most about Hebrews is something we find from the very beginning of the book, and it's what we would call a high Christology. That is showing Jesus as who he truly is, and that is the Son of God as divine himself. And we have a number of texts, and I've referred to this in the past in these RTBs, that have this high Christology, and there's probably 4 of those texts that are most famous for being the most complete explanations of who Jesus is as the Son of God, as divine. And that is John 1. We've dealt with that one already. We also have Philippians 2 and Colossians 1. So we've dealt with all those texts, and now we're here at Hebrews 1, 1 through 4. So let's read 1 through 4 here. I know we're going a little bit long in this first one. This first RTB of my time back, but let's just read 1 through 4, and I want you to meditate on this text today, because it does, and just think about how this portrays Jesus. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things. Now, I mentioned this in my sermon this past week, that we are co-heirs with Christ, but Jesus is the heir of the true heir. He is the true Son of God, right? He is the Son who succeeded where all the sons in the Old Testament, whether it's Israel or the king, fail. And he's not just the heir of all things, but he's also the one who made the world. He's the creator. He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his nature. So speaking of his divine nature here. And he upholds up all things by the word of his power. When he made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Father and the majesty on high, having become much better than the angels. Now, oftentimes when we talk about Jesus and his person and his work, we'll speak of the threefold office of Jesus, that he is and it's fulfilling the major offices that we find in the Old Testament: prophet, priest, and king. And we see all 3 of those here in this text. God spoke long ago, but now he's spoken to us in his fathers. Well, how did he speak long ago? He spoke through the prophets. Well, now Jesus, as that final word, that final prophetic word, through his person and work. He is the king who is sitting down at the right hand of the power on high. So there's the prophet, the king, and then he's also made purification of sins. So he's the priest as well. So we have here the perfect picture, I think, according to the author of Hebrews, of who Jesus is, even today, as the reigning king, the king who is the priest king who made purification for our sins and is the perfect revelation of God, proclaiming his in his person and work the true nature of who God is. And then in the end of this chapter, he goes through lots of Old Testament quotations speaking of the supremacy of Christ, particularly over angels here. So lots of stuff here in this first chapter of Hebrews, lots of stuff in our RTB today. And I know I've gone overboard here, but if you have questions or comments or follow up, feel free to drop those in or drop me an email. I'd be glad to talk to you about those. So I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, April 26th, 2021.